With great power comes great responsibility.
Compromise where you can. Where you can't, don't. Even if everyone is telling you that something wrong is something right, even if the whole world is telling you to move, it is your duty to plant yourself like a tree, look them in the eye and say, no, you move.
Never step onto the battlefield of ideas unprepared. Before you enter the fray, you need a plan. And there's no better place to get one than right here on Tactics with host Caleb Colquitt. The Situation Room goes live now on News Radio 1440.
Welcome in, everybody. We'll just have to deal with it right now. Sorry about that. All right, so lots of news to go through today. Lots happening over the weekend, and a lot of it is absolutely amusing. We're going to get to that. Before we do, I do want to say that tomorrow we actually won't be able to pull off a show because of everything going on with the Capital City Classic. Unfortunately, there's going to be some conflicts with that. Of course, the Capital City Classic, Auburn, Alabama, playing baseball right here in Montgomery Riverwalk Stadium. And at the radio station, we're their official affiliate, so it's all hands on deck. We're an Auburn affiliate and a Biscuits affiliate. So as you can imagine, that means we do quite a lot for the Capital City Classic. If you do want to come hang out, I do very much advise you do that. It's always a great event. But that's where I will be tomorrow. So lots going on tomorrow. Won't be able to actually do a show tomorrow. But there is a lot to talk about today. So we're going to go ahead and get right into that right this second. So Terry Sewell, and by the way, I am still trying to recover. You know how it is. It's pollen season in Alabama, and just for about, I'd say somewhere around mid-October, early November, it's just going to be like this because of how terrible the pollen is every single year. But that having just started right now, it may be a while before I recover, but I'm going to do the best that I can to just sort of power through it. So Terry Sewell, Congresswoman from Alabama, represents the district just to our west. So a lot of our friends that may be listening out in the Selma area, Tuscaloosa, I don't know if our district actually does include Tuscaloosa, but it's sort of that West Alabama area. Excuse me. Anyway, Terry Sewell did an interview on PBS yesterday, and we're going to discuss that just for a moment. And one of the things that she did was talked a lot about illegal immigration and why she voted against the national emergency measure. So for those of you who haven't quite kept up with the story, Donald Trump, of course, issued a national emergency to justify spending money on the border wall. And the way that he did this was under the saying that because illegal immigration has gotten to the point to where it's essentially a national emergency, a sentiment, by the way, I agree with, that's the justification for going ahead and getting rid of the roadblocks to building a wall, and so we're going to go ahead and just build it. Now, there were a couple reasons why I didn't agree with this. I tend to take the more libertarian stance on this, the more constitutional stance on this, which is, even though I agree that it's a national emergency, and I agree it's a issue that needs our attention, and I agree with the wall being built, the reason that I don't think it's the right way to do it is because I think pushing this agenda item through without the consent of Congress and abusing executive power like this is a bad precedent to set for the future. And that's part of the reason that I didn't really agree with it. But, you know, let's not get bogged down into that. I've already given my explanation on where I stand on that issue. What I want to focus now is that Terry Sewell was asked questions about this. And so because of this, she was talking about her positions on it and on immigration as a whole. And so the irony in all of this is, for the record, Terry Sewell and I actually are, weirdly enough, on the same side of this issue. We're just on the same side for very, very, very different reasons. I'm worried about the constitutionality. I'm worried about the precedent that this sets for future presidents just basically asserting, it's been a long time and Congress isn't doing what I'd like them to do, so I'm just going to declare a national emergency and bypass Congress to spend money on what I want to. That's a really dangerous precedent to set. And that's the reason that I don't think that this was a wise endeavor by President Trump, even though I agree with his end goal that he's trying to accomplish. But nonetheless, Terry Sewell is giving this interview on PBS yesterday and says this, quote, I believe that we in Congress are doing a huge disservice by not doing comprehensive immigration reform. I do think that it's necessary. I believe that it's important that we enforce laws that are on the books, but I don't believe that we need a wall from sea to shining sea to actually protect us, especially not against the women and children who are fleeing countries, war-torn countries, and countries where the violence is so bad that mothers will send their children and unaccompanied in search of a better life. We have a legal means on our books for those who are seeking asylum. That's a legal form of entering our country. All right, so here's the thing. Just about everything in that statement is either completely wrong or wildly misleading. And this is the issue that you run into most of the time with most people discussing this issue. So Terry Sewell just kind of adopts all of the liberal talking points and sort of restates them in her own words and acts like she's accomplished something important. So one of the things that she mentions is that we need to go ahead and do immigration reform. By the way, this is something that I'm for and most conservatives are for. Now, there are some exceptions, but the vast majority of conservatives are very much in favor of figuring out a way to reform the immigration system as it exists now, because becoming a citizen is incredibly time-consuming and incredibly expensive, and there are a lot of conservatives that think that this does need an overhauling and we do actually need to make it a little easier to become an American citizen. I happen to be in that camp. So this is not something that she's arguing against, or at least she is arguing against, but it's not really an argument that very many people on the right or left are making. Here's the issue, though. We cannot really have comprehensive immigration reform unless we first secure the border. That's the issue. And I know this is an analogy that you've probably heard before, but the truth is it just works. If your bathtub's overflowing, you can't start mopping up the water right away. You turn off the faucet first, figure out a way to fix the leak, then you start worrying about cleanup. You fix the source of the problem first, and then you start cleaning up the mess that it left. And that's exactly the way that it is here with illegal immigration. When it comes to illegal immigration, the problem is we have people continuing to spill across the border over and over and over again, and we keep trying to talk about, well, what do we do with these people? Well, that's a good debate to have, but you got to secure the border first. We've got to get this under control. And the people that tell you that it is under control and that we don't have a problem with this, they're either lying to you or they are ignorant of the facts. This February was one of the record high months that we've had in illegal border crossings. I mean, this problem is not going away. It's getting worse. Now, it was a lot better under Trump than it was under Barack Obama, and we hadn't had anything close to surge levels that we did, I believe, back in 2012 and 2014. So, for a while it had gotten better, but it's continuing to go back and forth, and this problem is not solving itself. So what we've got to do is we've got to figure out a way to stem the tide, then we can worry about cleaning up the mess that it left. And that's really the problem that Terry Sewell seems to be having, is that she says, well, we just need to reform the immigration system. I'm all for that, but we can't do it before we have stopped the flow of immigration across our border. And another thing, nobody is suggesting a wall from sea to shining sea. She's intentionally misrepresenting the argument here. She's essentially saying, well, I don't think we need a wall from sea to shining sea to protect us. Nobody that is serious on this issue, nobody that I'm aware of in the public sphere, right or left, is suggesting this. President Trump also is not suggesting this. If you look at his proposals during the budget fight that we had during the government shutdown, every single one of his proposals, without exception, even the very first one that he put out, had comprehensive reforms when it came to border patrol and border security. It included a wall, yes, but it also included increased patrols, drones, all this other stuff that is being talked about. And another thing, too, this idea that sea to shining sea, that wasn't really a good characterization of it either. Because President Trump has said for a long time, and conservatives have been saying for a long time, you don't need a continuous wall across the entirety of the border. And Trump has said this as far back as during the campaign. There's about 1,000 or so miles on the border that natural borders make it pretty much impossible to cross. I was looking at one particular documentary on the southern border, and they showed some areas where you've got 30-foot cliffs on either side of a river. Well, obviously you don't need a wall there, because if you've got a 30-foot climb down one side of a cliff and then a 30-foot climb up another side of a cliff, and then do you really think that a 20-foot wall is going to make a difference there if you're in that situation? No. Obviously, it's not going to make a difference. And so there are several parts on the border that you don't actually need a wall, or that a wall, even if you put one there, wouldn't really help. And so because of that, and with that knowledge, there is nobody on this issue that I'm aware of that's a serious person, a serious political pundit on the right or left, that's saying we need walls across the entirety of the border. It's just not happening. So she's intentionally misrepresenting the argument, saying that, well, we don't need a wall across the entire border. Yet no one's saying that we do. We're just saying there are some parts where we do need a wall. That's all that's being said here. So another thing, the overwhelming majority of illegals are men. Mostly grown men. And Terry Sewell is again misrepresenting the thing by saying, well, we don't need protection from women and children that are fleeing wars. No, if we're talking about a woman and some children that are actually fleeing a war, now to my knowledge there's not a war going on anywhere in South America. Maybe I'm just not up on the times on that, but to my knowledge, there's not a war going on in Mexico. I think maybe she's confusing this with the Syrian refugees, even though that war is actually kind of done now too. For those of you who didn't know, the caliphate, the last vestiges of that actually fell last week, which, you know, great news. And we appreciate our American military for doing that. Great job, guys. But she's again trying to mischaracterize what we're talking about here. If you have a legitimate woman with some children that are seeking asylum, fine. There's a legal process for that. They can go through it. Nobody is talking about ending that. What we are talking about is the potential women and children that are coming across illegally, that don't show up at a border station, that aren't seeking asylum, and don't actually have a reason to qualify for asylum. They just want to live in America. That's not what asylum is. We went through on the show, and you can go back and look at it in the archives. We went through the actual legal definition of asylum seeking, and we weren't even using America's definition. We were using the UN. And by their definition of asylum seeking, there's nothing in there that allows you to just basically shop around for whatever country you want to live in. That's not how this works. If you want to seek asylum, you have to be in fear of your own life. In other words, there has to be a reason that someone is specifically targeting you in your country, or the conditions in your country are so unlivable that you have a legitimate fear of returning home. That's fine. I don't know of anybody on the right that is saying that that shouldn't be allowed. What is being said by people on the right is we've got to figure out a way to stem the tide. And here's the thing. A wall wouldn't affect those people anyway. Because if you're seeking asylum, you go to a border station. Now, there will not be a wall in front of the border station. I don't realize if Representative Sewell realizes this, but the wall is not going to impede asylum seekers. And so, just from beginning to end, this entire statement is either completely wrong or technically correct, but incredibly misleading in the way she characterizes the other side of the argument. So she continues on in this particular interview and says, quote, "So I want to be very clear. I do believe in immigration reform. I think that we need it. But I believe, kiddingly say to my staff, I wish we could have President for 1 hour a day walking through my district. I could show him what $5.7 billion can do to turn around communities within our own country. I believe that a smart wall, and I think that we can do more through drones and increased patrol, enforcing the laws that are on the books now." Okay, now I realize I just said this. Like I said before, every single one of President Trump's proposals for the border wall, all of them, including the one that you're saying, no, we need to vote against that, we need to make sure that Trump can't do that, includes increased drones, increased patrols. It includes all those other things. A wall just happens to be a part of it. And the $5.7 billion that she's talking about would be used to help construct that border wall. Here's the problem with that, though. If you're looking at this statement, it proves that Representative Sewell knows nothing about the Constitution. Not at all. Because you're saying, well, that 5.7, we could use that to rebuild our communities and turn around our communities, and I could show President Trump what that could be used for. Yeah, here's the problem with that. Securing the border, protecting the states from invasion, is mentioned twice in the Constitution, most prominently in Article 4, Section 4. The federal government has an actual obligation to prevent invasion of people from other countries into the states. That is a federal mandate enshrined in our Constitution. Nowhere in the Constitution, at any point, does it justify using money in individual communities. Not once. In fact, it actually strictly forbids it. If you look at Amendment 10, it clearly states that any powers not granted to the federal government by the Constitution is guaranteed to the states or the people, the enumerated powers. And so you actually not only don't have authority for it in the Constitution, but the 10th Amendment says, since you don't have authority to just spend money in communities for community development or economic development or whatever else you want to call it, the 10th Amendment strictly prohibits the Fed from doing that. Now, I realize the Fed does stupid junk like this all the time. It's called pork barrel spending. But my point in all of that is, the argument that Terry Sewell is making is completely non-constitutional. It's against what the Constitution says. You can spend money as a federal government on the border. That's part of the Fed's job. Spending money in communities is not part of the federal government's job. Now, I realize that Terry Sewell would love to get her hands on some federal money and dole it out to people in her district because, unfortunately, in this country, that seems to be the formula for getting reelected. And if you don't believe me, ask Senator Richard Shelby. But I guess evidently that's what she is admitting there in that particular interview, that that's really what she would prefer to do. But again, she just completely misrepresents the whole thing. Nobody is suggesting that we don't have increased patrols. Nobody is suggesting that we don't have drones and use other technology. We're just saying, and a border wall needs to be a part of that. So why is it the Democrats seem so gung-ho about the quote-unquote smart wall? And why do you think that they love the idea of increased patrols and increased drones, but they don't want a border wall? Here's part of the reason, and this is just my thought process on this. Let's say that for whatever reason, whether you believe this is going to happen or not, let's say that one of the Democratic hopefuls right now running for president becomes president instead of Trump. Let's just say that happens. And this has happened after the quote-unquote smart wall has been put into place. Well, the Democrat Party has shown a propensity to try to bring in as many illegals as possible because they are breeding voters. If all you got is a smart wall, and it just consists of increased patrols and drones, all you have to do is do essentially what Barack Obama did, which is cripple ICE and cripple our border patrol and not give them the resources that they need to do their job and implement policies that make it easier for illegal immigrants to slip through and stay here. That's very easy to do when you're talking about a smart wall. If you have drones or you have patrols, all you have to do is decrease the amount of drones and decrease the patrols and turn off the security systems. Can't turn off a wall. There's not a magic switch that you can flip on a wall that the wall just magically disappears once it's built. And with the exception of Beto O'Rourke, even the farthest left of the left Democrats aren't suggesting that you tear down the border wall that exists, because they know how ridiculous and unpopular that sounds. And so what you have here is the reason that they're vying for something other than an actual physical impediment to entering this country illegally is because they know the physical impediment is going to stay. They know the physical impediment is going to be something that is an obstacle at the very least for people trying to cross the border illegally long term that they can't just shut down or cut funding to. That's the reason that they don't want an actual physical structure on the border. And she keeps saying, well, we just need to enforce the laws that are on the books. Yeah, that's what we think too. The problem is, because nobody's suggesting, to my knowledge, new laws. The problem is we can't enforce the laws with the current enforcement tools that we have. A border wall would assist us with that. Not fix all the problems. It's not a silver bullet. But having such a wall would really help Border Patrol and other agencies in stopping illegal crossings. And that's the thing. We need to be able to get the situation under control so that we can enforce the laws that are on the books. It would be the same thing if you take illegal immigration out of it completely. If you had a town that was overrun with vagrants and vagabonds and criminals of different kinds, and you had all kinds of robberies and that sort of thing, and you said, well, we just need to enforce the laws that are on our books. Those things are already illegal. The problem is we don't have enough police officers, or the problem is, we're spread too thin, whatever else it may be. The point is, you can't just yell, well, let's enforce the laws that are on our books. If you don't have the resources to enforce the laws, having those laws does no good. And that's been the point of this entire debate from the beginning. So Sewell is primarily just straw-manning this whole thing and making arguments that nobody has ever made or nobody is making, misrepresenting the argument and then knocking it down and acting as though she's accomplished something, even though that's not an argument that anybody is making on either side of the aisle in the first place. It just shows that Terry Sewell has a problem thinking for herself. All right, so we're going to take a quick break here, and when we come back, we're going to have a little bit of fun with this. There is a lot going on in the national media with the investigation finally coming to a head, the Mueller investigation coming out, and we're going to be talking about that on the other side of this break in just a second.
And now for a reading from the Social Justice Warrior Bible with Pastor Gregory Post.
Welcome in. I'm Gregory Post, head pastor at the Eternal Living Word Trans-Denominational Community Church and Coffee House in Novato, California. And now it's time once again for another reading of the SJW Bible. Today's story is going to be about how Naaman was cured of his leprosy in 2 Kings chapter 5, verses 8 through 14. And it says, "It happened when Elisha, the man and or woman of God, depending on how he identified at the time, heard that the king of Israel had torn his clothes, and he sent word to the king, saying, 'Why have you torn your clothes? Now let him come to me, and he shall know that there is a prophet in Israel.' So Naaman came with his horse and his chariots, which were sustainably raised and emitted no greenhouse gases, and stood at the doorway of the house of Elisha. Elisha sent a messenger to him, saying, 'Go and wash in the Jordan 7 times, and your flesh will be restored to you, and you will be clean.' Not that I'm implying that you were dirty just because you were a leper. That would be leper shaming. But Naaman was furious and went away, saying, 'Behold, I thought, he will surely come out to me and stand and call on the name of the Lord his God, and wave his hand all over the place and cure the leper. Are not Abana and Paphra and the rivers of Damascus better than all the waters of Israel? Could I not wash in them and be clean?' So he turned and went away in rage. Then his servants came near and spoke to him, saying, 'Wow, that Elisha guy is such a xenophobic jerk. Where does he get off implying that the rivers in Israel are better than the rivers in our country? That nationalist jerk probably believes in Israeli exceptionalism too.' So then God spoke to Naaman directly and said, 'Naaman, I am so sorry for being intolerant and not accommodating enough. I should never have asked you to have to go and do something to be cured. You believe in me, and since purification comes from faith only, I'll just go ahead and heal you right here and now.' And from that hour forward, his flesh was cured, and they all went out to try some local craft beer." Wow, so inspirational. Thank you for listening to this reading of the SJW Bible. And remember, the only truth that matters is your truth. And welcome back, everybody. Thank you for that. And here's the thing that really we need to be talking about, because frankly, it's just a lot of fun. The Trump investigation ended Friday, and you'll remember that we talked about that, and I gave some of my predictions, all of which came true, by the way. But the Trump investigation essentially ended in a giant pile of nothing. Because there were a couple of questions that were asked, primarily on Russia collusion, which the report essentially said there's no evidence of that whatsoever. And then there was the obstruction of justice, where it said there's some evidence, but not enough to actually recommend a prosecution, so we're going to kind of punt on that as well. And so this investigation that has been talked about ad nauseum way too much, in fact, so much that I actually made it a rule to stop talking about it for a week because it was sucking all the air out of the news cycle, and I had to stop covering it. The cable news channels just talked about it constantly, worked it into other unrelated stories. This was the big moment, and it comes out, and there was nothing inside. Absolutely nothing. And in response to this, the DNC actually has issued an official reply from the Democrat Party. Let's take a look.
Donald J. Trump is now President of the United States. President Obama is the ex-president. And Mr. Trump, for the moment, steps away for the inaugural
What a great honor
address.
to be able to introduce for the first time ever anywhere the 45th President of the United States of America, Donald.
Pump on the shoulder. You adjust the microphone as you talk, man.
For their gracious aid.
I am so sorry to my world. I am so sorry to my world. This is not what we want.
All right, so as you can see there, oh man, here's the thing. That clip is from Donald Trump's inauguration. I'm sure that you've probably seen it before, but the reason that I use it is because it's just funny. And that really does feel like what all the cable news media personalities and all of the liberals are doing in the wake of Bob Mueller's report turning into a big nothing burger. But it really is indicative of this larger story. And what I mean by that is the hopes and dreams of the Democrats have essentially been riding on the results of Bob Mueller and his investigation. Because the thing is, before he was even inaugurated, they were convinced that he was the worst president that there has ever been, and they've been trying to get rid of him since before he was even sworn in. You'll remember that Maxine Waters actually tried to move to impeach the president before he was even actually president. She actually tried to bring that up on the floor, and some of her fellow Democrats were like, Maxine, he hasn't been sworn in yet. We got to wait until he gets sworn in to try to impeach the guy. But this whole thing is just absolutely hysterical. I've been thoroughly enjoying watching the news this week, just watching the liberals' heads explode over this. Because ever since the inauguration, and really since even before that, the idea has been we have to get rid of Trump. Don't care how we do it, as long as we do it. And that was the problem with putting all their eggs in one basket and deciding that this was going to be the thing that got rid of Trump. They're kind of like, Charlie Brown in the football with Lucy. So many times over the course of Trump's presidency, they have run up to that football, and then at the last second, Lucy just snatches it away, and then they wind up flat on their back wondering could this happen? You remember this whole thing happened with Stormy Daniels and Michael Avenatti. They said the same thing when there were raids on the houses of people like Paul Manafort and Roger Stone and, what's the other guy's name? Michael Cohen. And then when different people would flip on Trump, including Cohen, including Flynn, this time we've got him, this time we've got him, this time we've got him, this time we've got him. And constantly, over and over again, it turns out there's nothing there. And this is the reason that they keep seeing these giant disappointments, is because they set their expectations way too high. And this has been the problem ever since the beginning, because they don't really care whether Trump committed a crime or not. They just want him out of the White House for political reasons. And that has been the issue that has been defining this entire investigation. they don't really care whether he colluded with Russia or not. They don't like him as a president, and they want him out of office. Now, they could just be honest about that and say that, but they can't handle the fact that Donald Trump actually won the presidency, which, honestly, if he were facing pretty much anybody other than Hillary Clinton, he probably wouldn't be the president. But the problem with this is that they have just convinced themselves that Trump's presidency is illegitimate and he doesn't need to be in the White House. And because of that, we don't really care how we get him out of office as long as we get him out. And that's been the problem from the very beginning. So the left has just absolutely lost their minds on this. And I have to say, this has been so entertaining that it actually pulled me away from March Madness to watch weekend cable news. It's just been that entertaining. Been sitting back with popcorn, watching the liberals' heads explode, and it has been phenomenal. But if you're talking about March Madness, the madness that is going on in the wake of this particular story is probably the best way to describe it. But anyway, with all of this going on, this is actually indicative of the larger problems. The larger problem that I was just talking about is that they want him out by any means necessary, by hook or by crook. And this is why they have even turned to people like Stormy Daniels or Michael Avenatti or Michael Cohen, who are all sleazy dirtbag individuals, hoping that this was going to be the thing that got Trump out of office. One thing that was really important, too, is that you've seen the flip-flop back and forth, and we'll come back to that in a second, on each of these individuals, because back when Michael Cohen, for example, was working for President Trump, he was a horrible person. He was just the president's fixer. He was loyal to President Trump, and he was just this evil, evil figure. And then all of a sudden, even though excuse me. Pardon me. Sorry about that. Even though this is a guy that has been convicted of perjury, they're saying we ought to trust his testimony and we believe what he has to say. And the same thing with James Comey, for example. You remember the FBI director that was fired. With James Comey, they were talking about how James Comey is the reason that Hillary Clinton lost the election and he's the most evil person there is, and we can't believe that he opened this investigation just a few days before the election and he's the reason that Hillary Clinton didn't win the presidency. And then he turned on Trump and they're like, oh, James Comey, he's the most honorable man in Washington. He's just a pillar of integrity. It's just so funny to watch them do a complete 180 and not even realize the hypocrisy, not even realize the blatant inconsistency that is happening here. So that being said, this is ironically the same thing that got Trump elected. It really is. Because these people that they've put their faith in, nobody should ever put their faith in people like Stormy Daniels or Michael Avenatti for any reason. But these people that they've put their faith in, the reason that they have done it is because that they are convinced in their own mind that it doesn't matter how bad they are as long as they get rid of Trump. Trump is the ultimate source of evil in the entire universe. And so because Trump is the source of ultimate evil, we have to get rid of him no matter what. There's actually a pretty good parallel here to one of C.S. Lewis's classic books. If you're looking at the Chronicles of Narnia, Book 4, Prince Caspian, there is a scene where one of the characters, Nickabrick, that's actually supposed to be a good guy, he sides with a hag, a witch, and a werewolf, even though he knows that they're evil, and has them try to resurrect the White Witch, a villain from another book, in order to drive out the Telmarines, the bad guys in this book. And the logic there is, I don't care how bad they are as long as they get rid of the Telmarines. Nothing is as bad as the Telmarines. So essentially, it's the quote-unquote lesser of two evils argument. And that's the problem that you run into. That when you start accepting one evil, it's still evil. They didn't care that Stormy Daniels was a disgusting porn star. They didn't care that Michael Avenatti was an incredibly sleazy, shady lawyer. They didn't care that Michael Cohen is a despicable human being. As long as they got rid of Trump, they didn't care. And oddly enough, even though Trump's a pretty terrible human being too, the reason that he got elected is because there was a large swath of the Republican base that was sitting there thinking, you know, out of all these people, I get Ted Cruz and Marco Rubio and Rand Paul and Ben Carson, but Trump just, I think that he's the one that will bludgeon Hillary over the head night and day, and that's the reason I'm going to go with him. They basically thought, and I still have people tell me this to this day, even though I disagree with them, and I think that the numbers actually really help my case on this, but won't get off into this argument and reliving that again, that really any of the Republicans in that particular race would have beaten Hillary Clinton. But there was a large plurality of the Republican base that had convinced themselves the only person that was going to beat Hillary Clinton was Donald Trump. And the reason they convinced themselves of that is because the guy is a human hammer. And he is. I mean, he just beats people over the head, verbally, of course, all day long. That's who the guy is. He is a hammer in search of a nail. And during the election, the nail that he constantly found himself whacking was Hillary Clinton. And, to his credit, it did work. They were at least right on that. He did wind up beating Hillary Clinton. I was convinced that several other candidates could have beaten her. But nonetheless, don't want to relive that argument. My point is, the same sentiment of Hillary Clinton is so bad that we have to pick somebody that is just going to bludgeon her day and night, and we don't care about his character. It's actually exactly the same sentiment that led the Democrats to put hitch their wagon up to the horses of Stormy Daniels and Michael Avenatti, and it's the reason they put so much of their hope into this particular election, the Mueller investigation. And they were so hopeful about it, and they were so convinced that this was going to be the thing that brought Trump down, and just like every other time, nothing came of it. And this is really the result of Democrats not playing it smart. If Democrats wanted to win the next election and basically ensure that President Trump would not win, really all they would have to do, and I mean, who knows? Trump might wind up losing the next one. Nobody can predict the future. That may still happen. But the way that they could have ensured that is they could have tried to make themselves look like the adults in the room. They could have tried to paint themselves as people that were above Trump and they didn't stoop to his childish tactics and they were going to be reasonable and let's just wait and see where this investigation goes. Maybe there was collusion, maybe there wasn't. We don't know. That's not what the Democrat Party has done. They have been telling you, convinced from day one, that Trump absolutely stole the election from Hillary Clinton with the help of Russia. That has essentially been the talking point, and they have been convinced of this from the day it happened, actually since before it happened, which led to the investigation in the first place. And here's the thing. What's really sad? They still aren't letting go of that argument. To this day, they still hold on to that belief. And if you don't believe me, even though this investigation has come out, if you don't believe me, we'll go ahead and look at this clip. This is a clip from House Judiciary Committee Chair Jerry Nadler saying that, he knows there was collusion. There's no doubt about that, even though that's the exact opposite of what this report says. They will not let go of this thing.
Do you accept that no member of the Trump team engaged in that kind of criminal conspiracy with Russia?
Well, I don't know. First of all, we don't know what indictments are forthcoming from other investigations that have been spun out by the special prosecutor to the Southern District of New York or the Eastern District of Virginia.
Right, but his main mission was about Russia. You think he would? Yes. You think Mueller would send that to other parts of the Justice Department?
I don't know. That's one of the things we will have to see when we read the report, and that's one of the reasons that I think it's so crucial that the entire report and the evidence underlying it be released to the public. Transparency is key here. I mean, obviously, we know there was some collusion. I mean, we know that the president's son and campaign manager were involved in a meeting with the Russians to receive a stolen, they thought was to receive stolen information stolen by the Russians from the Democratic National Committee as part of the Russian government attempt to help Trump in the election. That's the way the email inviting them to the meeting put it.
But none of what you just said has risen to the level of criminal indictment by the special counsel.
No, it hasn't.
All right, so what you're seeing there, several things that I want to go ahead and go through in that clip. So the House Judiciary Committee, Jerry Nadler, says, oh, we know there was collusion. Well, the report said that there wasn't. Yeah, but we know that it actually happened. Well, how do you know that it actually happened? Well, we know. How do you know? The thing is, he doesn't know. This is basically the standard, which I guess is the new Democrat standard of wishful thinking. We want there to be collusion, ergo collusion happened. We want there to be a conspiracy between Trump and Russia, and therefore it did happen. Which, by the way, is a really cynical way to look at things, because the Democrats now are all upset that there was not a plan, a secret conspiracy between the President of the United States and Russia. Think about that for a second. They're angry that our president is not a puppet of the Kremlin. They would have rather him been. Now, goodness knows, if you reversed it and say this happened to President Barack Obama, first of all, that would have been far more believable with some of the things that he said to Russia. But nonetheless, let's pretend that this were reversed and we found out that Barack Obama was actually secretly working for the Kremlin. He was actually a Russian agent, because that's what this investigation was about. Was the president working with Russia, and there was a quid pro quo between the two of them? He was giving them things, giving them favors on behalf of their aid in some way. As much as I disliked President Obama, as much as I would have liked a good reason to impeach him, I would not have been happy about him being an agent of a foreign country. The Democrats are upset that Trump isn't. Think about how insane that is, and how they're putting their own politics ahead of the good of the country. So let's look at those quotes that he was just saying. First, he tries to deflect attention to other investigations other than Russia. Because you'll remember when she was asking him about this, he said, well, we don't know what the investigation that the Mueller investigation put to other jurisdictions over. Yeah, but the thing is, on Russian collusion, first of all, it said that there was no evidence in that one. And second of all, that wouldn't be a state issue anyway. This would be a federal issue, because it would have been a federal crime. So while those investigations could turn up some things maybe on obstruction of justice or completely unrelated charges, looking at Russian collusion, which is what the question was about in the first place, that would not have been something that was deferred to a lower jurisdiction, because that would have been a federal crime. Second, he's asking, well, we need to see the entire report, and transparency is crucial here. To an extent, and in the intent of what he's saying, I actually agree. We do need to see as much of the report as possible. The problem with that is the DOJ does have a rule that if there are no indictments, you don't release possible supporting evidence on that. Why? Because we have a standard in this country that you are innocent until you are proven guilty. And because of that, if we find evidence on an innocent man, but none of that evidence, even though it might be embarrassing for the person, doesn't stack up to being an actual crime, you can't release that evidence. So they're hoping that Mueller found some things that make President Trump look politically bad or politically unpalatable. And that's the reason that they want the entirety of the investigation out. But that's politics. That's not a crime, and that's not Mueller's job. Mueller's job was not to dig up dirt on Trump that the Democrats can use against him. His job was to determine, did Trump commit a crime or not? And his conclusion was no. The Democrats don't accept this, so they're saying, well, we need to see the whole report so that we can... No, that's not how this works. His job was not to do opposition research on the president for you. There are private investigators and other people that will do that if you want to, but you're going to have to pay them, and you can't use taxpayer money to do that. And let's not forget that this investigation cost $25 million in that respect. And so despite this, what's going to happen is they're going to start screaming, oh, this was a cover-up. In fact, some of them have already started doing it, saying that this whole thing was corrupt and Bob Mueller was really in the tank for Trump the whole time, and what's going on here is that he was bought and paid for by Trump, or what's happening is that the Attorney General is lying about this, and that was actually something that was suggested earlier, that he was lying about the report, and that's not really what the report says. This letter from the Attorney General was misleading, and it didn't actually include what the investigation said. even though it uses quotes directly from the investigation, but let's not get off into details here. But that's really the assertion that you're going to see, is they're going to stick to this narrative of Trump colluded with Russia until the day they die, despite there being no evidence to support that. Because, as Representative Nadler just demonstrated, it's essentially the logic of wishful thinking. We want there to be collusion, ergo we believe that collusion happened. We don't need evidence. We just have to say that it happened. That seems to be the new standard for the Democrat Party. And finally, to address something else that he said, well, we know that there was collusion because of the Trump Tower meeting. Now, I have said for months, and I'm not going to repeat the whole thing because frankly I'm tired of saying it over and over again. The Trump Tower meeting was a really stupid move. And Paul Manafort, one of the unsavory characters that actually was indicted in all of this on separate, unconnected charges, Paul Manafort should have had the good sense to keep Donald Trump Jr. out of that meeting. And that meeting should have never occurred between Donald Trump Jr. or anybody else in the Trump circle. That meeting shouldn't have happened. But what was happening at that meeting was that there was a promise that this person, very well connected to the Kremlin, had dirt on Hillary Clinton. What Nadler just said is, well, they knew that it was going to be information that was stolen from the DNC and given to the... They didn't know that. There's no evidence that that's what they thought was going on. All they were promised was dirt on Hillary Clinton. That's it. Now, does that look really bad? Yes. Should Donald Trump Jr. have gone to that meeting? Absolutely not. There's no question about that. But the question isn't whether or not it was a good idea or whether or not it looked good. The question is, did a crime occur? First of all, at the very best, that would be attempted collusion because nothing actually came out of the meeting. There was no dirt on Hillary Clinton that was actually exchanged. But second of all, and far more importantly, even if that had taken place, opposition research is not a crime, even if it comes from a foreign power. And so even though it was weird and a really bad idea from a political standpoint, it doesn't make sense to say that it was a crime because there's not a law against that. So this idea that, well, we know collusion happened. No, it didn't. Maybe attempted collusion, but certainly not collusion, and certainly nothing that rose to the level of an actual crime. Even if they had given him information on Hillary Clinton, still not a crime. Because collusion would be them working together on a strategy to form some kind of conspiracy, some kind of criminal intent that they were going to coordinate their efforts to try to win the election. That's not what happened. It's not as though the Trump campaign was working with Russia and trying to figure out a way to game the votes and get more votes than her in certain states or something like that. None of this gets anywhere close to the ballpark of criminal conspiracy. And that really is the findings of this. So there are also people that are saying that the investigation now was not thorough enough, that we didn't spend enough time, enough money, enough resources on this. So to that, I would like to point this out to you. This investigation, and this is in the letter itself, included 2,800 subpoenas and about 500 witnesses, and took place over 22 months, almost 2 entire years, before this thing wrapped up. 500 witnesses, 2,800 subpoenas. They left no stone unturned. So the idea that this just wasn't thorough enough doesn't make any sense at all. And it is really funny watching several House Democrats suggest that they're going to use this information to call for more witnesses. I heard that over the weekend too. Like, well, what we can do now is we can take the information in this investigation and we're going to get to the bottom of this and call more. He already called 500 witnesses. And they're acting as though, oh, well, Mueller's hands were tied. He couldn't have called these witnesses. He already called 500 people to testify on this and try to get to the bottom of this. So the idea that now they're going to investigate it harder, basically they're taking the Peter Pan approach to this. that if you believe in something hard enough that you can do it. If you believe you can fly, then you can fly. If you've ever seen that movie Hook, like if you believe hard enough, your bowl is going to be filled with food. That's the Democrat strategy now. We have to believe that Russian collusion happened hard enough, and then evidence will magically appear in front of us, and we'll be able to impeach Trump. Look, all this boils down to is that the Democrats made a really, really stupid move. Because all they would have had to have done is say, yeah, the investigation's going on, we'll see where it goes. And in the meantime, there was plenty, and I do mean plenty, of legitimate criticisms of President Trump they could have gone after. But as always, the Democrats vastly overplayed their hand and promised that there was going to be charges of Russian collusion and criminal conspiracy. And of course, we know now that that's never going to come to fruition. Now, there was a second question. The first question that we need to deal with is collusion. This is what the report actually says. This is from the letter itself. Quote, the report further explains that the primary consideration of the special counsel's investigation is whether any Americans, including individuals associated with Trump campaign, knowing that the Russian conspiracies to influence the election would create a crime. The special counsel's investigation did not find that the Trump campaign or anyone associated with it conspired or coordinated with Russia in its efforts to influence the 2016 U.S. presidential election. As the report states, the investigation did not establish that members of the Trump campaign conspired or coordinated with the Russian government in the election interference activities. So essentially what is going on here is this proves that there was not only, listen to that last part, they didn't conspire, which would have been a crime, or coordinate. So not only do you not have conspiracy, you don't even have coordination. They can't prove that there was even some talking about strategy going on between the Trump campaign and Russia, much less an actual criminal conspiracy. So essentially, at least on this first subject, and not so much on the second subject that we get to, obstruction of justice, but on this first question of did the Trump campaign work with the Russians, this report, with 2,800 subpoenas, 500 witnesses, and it took 22 months, their findings are, nope, no sign of it whatsoever. That is astounding. Looks like we have a caller over here on line 1, so let's go ahead and go to the phones. Good afternoon, what's your name?
Hey, John, how you doing?
Hey, doing well. What do you think about all this?
I want to weigh in on first of all, the part about the Democrats and their reaction to it and their anger about it. I think that it proves a couple of things about them. First, I think that it proves they love their party and their ideology more than they do the country. Because I wouldn't want Russian collusion with a Democrat in.
Right.
That's bad for the country. And it proves to me, don't you think that they actually love their party more than the country?
I think they love themselves more than they love the country, which is pretty
close to the same thing.
Pretty close to the same thing.
And I hope that people will recognize that. It's almost like they like, we know how they stand on many of the racial issues, and they like riots and things to be upset. It makes them happier, even though people get hurt and things like that. Nobody wants anything like that. And it's the same way with this Russian collusion deal and the whole thing that has been transpiring. And all that's made us do, on my part, is like Trump better.
Well, see, and that's part of the issue, that I think that the long-term result of the way that the Democrats and the media especially have handled this entire investigation is that they see how ridiculous and over the top they were about this thing, even though it turned out to be absolutely nothing. And now it just exposes them to basically standing naked in front of the whole country. Now everybody knows that the only motivation they ever had for this was their own political gain. And so that, because of that, I think long term this is going to really hurt the Democrat Party. Because because now everybody can see it. I mean, most people really understood this anyway. And even some of those people in the middle that weren't really sure on it, they can see this party has been so completely blinded by their hatred of Donald Trump that they were willing to say or do anything that they thought even had a remote chance of knocking him out of office. And now all of that has been exposed to the entire country.
And when you rest all your eggs in one basket like that, and instead of your own policy, that's dangerous. Now they have nothing to go on because they've spent all this time, effort, and energy, and are still doing that today in the Progress Network. I've still heard them, I mean, the same idea, and they will not give up on this thing. Even though the proof doesn't have anything to do with it as far as they're concerned.
Well, you never get evidence and facts to get in the way of the narrative. I guess that's their stance on this. But thanks so much for your call. I appreciate it. Yeah, have a good one. So, and John from Millbrook does make an excellent point there, that this really does put on display that the Democrats are far more concerned with winning another election or being in the seat of power than they do actually the good of the country. Now, goodness knows that politics can blind anybody from any side of the aisle, but the Democrats have seen this on a wide scale throughout a majority of their base. And that's really what all of this exposes, is that even though they never had any reason to believe that this was going to take place, this exposes that they wanted it to take place because it was going to be politically beneficial. And the way that they're reacting really unfair. There was much wailing and gnashing of teeth, as it were, when it came to the Democrats over the weekend, and it proves that they're far more concerned with their own political power than they are with really anything. And that really is. So, there's a second question here that I do want to address, because it's not quite as clear-cut on this question as it was Russian collusion. So I want to read you another little excerpt of this, and this is on the question of obstruction of justice. That was the other part of this investigation. Not only did Trump collude with the Russians, or did it Trump's campaign collude with the Russians, but did the president try to obstruct justice and stop this investigation from taking place? So this is a quote taken from the letter. The special counsel states, quote, while this report does not conclude that the president committed a crime, it also does not exonerate him. So, on the first question, Russian collusion, no evidence of that whatsoever. On this one, it says, we're not really making a decision on it. There wasn't enough evidence to recommend a prosecution, but there was some kind of circumstantial evidence. And that probably is about right. Because they're essentially saying, we can't prove that he's guilty, or we can't even bring up enough evidence to suggest that he's probably guilty, so we're not going to recommend a prosecution, but we're also not saying that there were no signs of it, like we did with the Russian investigation, which, by the way, this ought to be a big red flag to anybody that is saying, well, you know, with the Russia investigation, all they were saying is that there was no evidence of it. Yeah, but here's the thing. If Mueller was unsure about Russian collusion, he would have answered that question the same way he did the obstruction of justice question, which is, we're not really sure, there's some circumstantial evidence, but, you know, it's hard for us to nail down whether or not he actually colluded with Russia or not. That's not what they said. They said there's no evidence of coordination whatsoever. So on this one, it's saying, we could kind of see some evidence towards obstruction of justice, which, frankly, I think is probably about right. And I say that because of Trump's constant attacks on people like Mueller and Sessions, and talking about how ridiculous the thing was, saying that it was a witch hunt over and over again. The president did what he does with everything that he doesn't like, which is constantly bash it and run his mouth about it. And unfortunately for President Trump, that does not look good when you're the president of the United States and you actually do have the power to do something about such an investigation. But Trump doesn't know how to shut his mouth on literally any subject, so he continued to talk about it and continued to talk about it. But here's essentially where all of this wraps up into a nice little bow. What this report seems to assert is that yes, Trump firing James Comey when he did, and then afterward going on CBS and talking about how the reason that he did it is because he didn't like how he was handling the Mueller investigation, looks really bad. And the fact that he was constantly tweeting about it and trying to put pressure in the media onto people like Robert Mueller, yeah, that looks really bad. But looking bad is not obstructing justice. There's a difference in thinking about obstructing justice, which is essentially what Trump's tweets amount to, and actual obstruction of justice. And there is a difference in talking about doing something and actually doing it. And while Trump talked an awful lot about it, because he talks an awful lot about everything, there is no indication that he actually actively took a step to try to stop the investigation or try to handicap it or whatever else. And because of that, and because you can't draw a one-to-one line to Trump saying that he was going to do something and actually doing something, and you can't draw a one-to-one line between Trump trying to shut down the investigation and him talking about trying to shut down the investigation, there's really nothing that you can do from a legal standing. There's nothing that you can do from a legal process mindset. So while it's probably a bad idea that Trump sort of handled things the way that he did, handling things poorly is not a crime. And that seems to be the assertion of this particular this particular question that this investigation seeks to answer. The most problematic thing, of course, would be the Comey firing, but even with that, they still found nothing. And even the Sessions firing amounted to essentially nothing, because even after Sessions was fired and they brought in a new attorney general, the new attorney general still didn't fire Robert Mueller. And so even though there were questions about that, and even though at times Trump said that the recusal from this investigation is the reason that he was firing Sessions, you still can't draw a one-to-one line between him trying to stop the investigation and firing Jeff Sessions. In fact, oddly enough, even though I thought this was a bad idea and still think that it was a bad idea that Trump did this, him constantly going after Jeff Sessions might have helped him in this. And here's what I mean by that. Because he talked about Jeff Sessions so poorly and attacked him constantly, that kind of leads a person from a legal mindset to think, yeah, it seems like he just really doesn't like the guy. And he's not firing him to get him to do something specifically, like fire Robert Mueller, to hire a new attorney general to fire Mueller. It sounds a lot more like he just doesn't like Sessions and doesn't like how he handles things, and that's probably why he fired him. So oddly enough, even though I still think it was a bad idea, attacking Sessions relentlessly probably actually helped him in that regard. And I know that's a weird way to think about it, but that's probably what happened. Now, one thing that the Democrats are trying to do is now they're trying to claim that William Barr is covering this whole thing up, and what's actually going on here is that William Barr showing up right around the time that the investigation wrapped up. That's really a sign that what happened is once Barr moved in, Mueller had to wrap it up at the last second and didn't have time to actually put what he really thought about the investigation in it. First of all, there's nothing to suggest that. Second of all, the idea that Bob Mueller is some kind of shrinking violet that wouldn't tell people about that is just absurd. Let's remember that Robert Mueller is also the guy that publicly said and found a microphone to talk about how BuzzFeed got essentially everything wrong in their reporting about what his investigation was looking at and what was going to come out of it. Robert Mueller is not somebody that's mic shy. If the Attorney General of the United States came out and was lying about what was in the report, don't you think Bob Mueller would have said something about that by now? Don't you think that he would have said, no, I said the exact opposite. I said that he totally colluded with Russia and was obstructing justice. Bob Mueller is not somebody that would just let someone else lie about his investigation and say, oh, well, I guess there's nothing I can do. And another thing, too, here, the suspicion that William Barr being appointed the Attorney General is what caused Mueller to have to wrap up his investigation quickly makes no sense. let's just say for the sake of argument that there were rumors going around a church building that the preacher and one particular brother in the congregation were having troubles. In other words, they had a disagreement or didn't like each other or something. And the way that you use, the thing that you use to prove that in your own mind is that the preacher was preaching on Sunday, and let's say he was already about 15 minutes over what his sermon usually goes. So instead of going 30 minutes, he was already at the 45-minute mark. And then this brother who was allegedly having a dispute, don't know why it was this late, but he was having this dispute with, walks in and sits down, and then once that guy sits down, the sermon was wrapped up within 5 minutes of that. And they say, see, that guy made him nervous, and when he walked into the church, that's when the preacher decided, oh, it's time to wrap it up. Isn't it far more likely to suggest that the preacher was already way over on time and that he was going to wrap it up anyway, regardless of whether that guy walked in or not? That's the far more likely explanation. And when you're talking about an investigation that had gone on almost 2 entire years and had gone this far into depth with everything, it's far more plausible to believe, especially considering that Mueller was talking about kind of wrapping this up long before he even knew that William Barr was going to be the Attorney General. Isn't it far more plausible that the Mueller investigation was about to wrap anyway? I mean, that just, I don't understand that explanation. So, I will say this one thing before we go. We do need to go ahead and make the check. The switch is going to be. There's going to be a giant shift in the public opinion on both sides. The pro-Trump people that will side with Trump no matter what, and believe that Trump always is right no matter what happens, and that there was no reason for this investigation to ever happen. Granted, there's some legitimate questions about it, but I'm not going into all that now, because that'll take 2 years worth almost as long as the investigation. But the people that are always and Trump can do no wrong, they were the ones that were saying this whole time, this whole thing is corrupt, there's absolutely no legitimacy to it, Bob Mueller is an evil Democrat grunt, it's really chummy with the Clintons, and he's just going to find stuff and make up stuff, and he's completely corrupt, and he's going to figure out a way to get rid of Trump. Those people are going to go right around and talk about Bob Mueller as though he is the greatest thing that's ever happened in D.C. The strongest, most confident, the guy with the most integrity out of anybody in D.C. That's how we're going to talk about Bob Mueller. And you're going to see the exact opposite on the left. The same people who are talking about how Mueller is one of the most honorable civil servants that we've ever had in this country, about how he is the best possible choice that couldn't have happened for the special counsel. That he was, I remember the exact words of one Democrat pundit who was talking about Robert Mueller and this investigation several weeks ago, said he is the best friend of an innocent man and a guilty man. Works not, of course, insinuating that Trump is guilty, and that's the reason he and Mueller were going to knock heads. But I remember him saying that he was the best friend of the innocent and a nightmare. Just giving these glowing testimonials about how wonderful Bob Mueller is. They're going to talk about how he was a plant, how he was bought and paid for by Trump. Now this whole thing is cover up and Mueller sold it. So it is going to be amusing to watch this complete 180 flip on both sides of the discussion. And I think that shows that this investigation as a whole, and the way that we talk about politics and talk to our friends and neighbors, has really become toxic. Been distilled to what side of the aisle you fall on. Unfortunately, this is especially true for Democrats because this is completely discredited just about everything they've said for the past few years. What's really, I think, on display is that your political leanings matter more than evidence in facts. Unfortunately, I'm afraid that is true for some time. Alright. That being said, real going to go to the chapter.
1875, the Continental Congress created the Chaplain Corps. Under the command of General George Washington, each soldier was required to attend worship service every Sunday. While other armies advanced on their feet, Washington's troops advanced on their knees. It's time for the Chaplain's Report with Caleb Colquitt on tactics.
Chaplain Report today comes from the Gospel of John, and it's not long before Christ is about to be crucified, but he's there with his disciples, and he really does see this opportunity as Christ so often did in his also teaching. So we're going to look at John 12:24-26. Truly I say to you, unless a grain of wheat falls to the earth, and it dies, it remains alive. But if it dies, it bears much fruit. He who loves his life shall lose it, and he who hates his life in this world will keep it for life eternal. If anyone serves me, he must follow me. And where I am, there my servant will be also. If anyone serves me, the Father will honor him. So just a lot of wisdom in this particular sermon. And one of the things that Christ gives this metaphor, very short little thing. He talks about wheat. And he says, when wheat falls to the ground and it doesn't die, it's alive. In other words, if you've ever seen a grain of wheat, wheat's pretty tiny. And by itself, if it's just on the ground, it's very minuscule. You can't really see it unless you're looking hard for it. And he's saying that it's kind of pointless. Not only is that grain of wheat all by itself, it's not really doing anything. And I think what he's describing is somebody that lives for themselves. Because if you live for yourself, you are going to be lonely. If you live and your primary concern is with how the world fits into your worldview, how it benefits you, and all you think about it, then of course that's going to alienate people. And even if you have so-called friends, you're still going to really get along because you don't have that real deep connection with other people. And another thing, you're not going to be doing it. Now, maybe you're a workaholic, maybe you accomplish a lot on this earth. At the end of time, that's not going to happen. And so that's where this analogy comes in. For a stalk of grain to be produced, the original seed has to go. That seed has to go away. Now, what it eventually turns into is a big, bountiful plant. And what does it produce? Grain. Lots of grain. Not one grain in particular. Not one grain lying by itself on the ground. Lots of grain. 100, maybe 200 times that original seed. And that's the point that Christ is making. If you want to do a work in the kingdom of God that produces fruit that is not alone, you have to be willing to give up what you need. You have to be willing to make sacrifices. And you have to abandon your selfish attitude and mindset. In order to be able to accomplish this, you have to be willing to lose your life, your own. Once you do that, it's going to be a painful process. It's not necessarily going to be easy. There's going to be a lot of growth required before you get to that stage where the grain is being produced and fruit is being put on. Where something is happening in your life, where you're seeing the impact. Sometimes it may take a long time. Otherwise, we're just a single brain people sitting there alone. Because it is only by submitting our will and giving up our life and our selfish desires to Christ and start living the way that He does, we're going to be able to bear fruit for our Father and be able to accomplish something. It is so much better than just being a lonely brain.
Tactics is a production of News Radio 1440 and Cumulus Media Montgomery. Any opinions expressed on this program are those of the host and do not necessarily reflect the opinions of Cumulus Media. The theme song for Tactics is 6 Foot Town by Big and Rich. Graphics by Jessica Dawson. Broadcast studios provided by Cumulus Media Montgomery. Location studios provided by the Dalraida Church of Christ. Copyright 2019.